Well, thank you for that really nice introduction. I am absolutely honored to be here and to present some really exciting findings. I think you all did a really nice job of pivoting us into talking about siblings. And I think this is a really underserved population, and I'm really excited that ASF has really led the charge in shining a spotlight on what we can do for SIBs. Oh, my clicker. Yes, I do need a clicker. Okay, perfect. So today I will be talking about understanding the needs of siblings as they grow up and kind of the relationship that they have with their autistic sibling. So we'll first kind of zoom out and talk generally about the importance of sibling relationships. We know that sibling relationships are often one of the most transformative and meaningful relationships that an individual can have across the lifespan. And one of the big reasons why this is the case is because the sibling relationship has a lifetime duration. And especially in autism, where we know that difficulties tend to persist across the lifespan, the sibling is kind of that built-in support that will last kind of throughout that lifespan and continue to provide that support as needed. We also know that siblings occupy many roles in that sibling relationship. So they can be the conversation partner, the play partner, the friend, the confidant, the support system. And that role can often change over time, and especially later as parents get older, that sibling can often take on the role of a caregiver. In thinking about, as Allison had mentioned, kind of this idea of an unaffected sibling, there's no such thing. And in the terms, I think that most people refer, yes, these siblings that we're talking about don't have autism themselves, but they are very much affected by having a sibling who is on the spectrum and will kind of continue to be affected throughout their lifetime. And so this idea of looking at siblings and seeing how we can better support siblings in helping them to support their autistic sibling is a real area of research interest. So just a general framework that we're going to be looking into autism prevalence and recurrence. Of course, this plays a role in how we are preparing for that next generation. Just some stats here. We know around 1.5 to 2.7% of children are diagnosed with autism. Around, sometimes this changes, 6 to 18.7% of these siblings also have ASD themselves. And then thinking about the next generation. Some studies show 3 to 5% of individuals with an autistic aunt or uncle will have ASD themselves, and this is kind of the path that we are looking into now. And this brings us to the Next Gen SIBS project that is generously funded by ASF, and we are extremely excited by some of the preliminary findings that we have found, and this will be the first time that we're showing them to ASF. So our Next Gen SIB study aimed to engage typically developing adult siblings in focus groups to really discuss their experience as kind of an individual who has an autistic sibling, kind of generally their thoughts and feelings about how having an autistic sibling has impacted their expectations for the future, really thinking about how that has related to decisions about parenthood. And also their attitude towards research. Are they willing to participate? What type of research would they need to kind of be seeing in order to be willing to participate? Generally, this is, so a kind of summary, it's a multi-site study underway at UCLA and Emory, and we are, again, conducting focus groups and individual interviews with typically developing siblings, and this is currently underway, though UCLA's part has finished, and this data represents what we found at UCLA. And we can come back to this later because I want to get to more of the key takeaways, the implications of what we found. But generally, here are the demographics. I would just note the gender differences. In our non-autistic sibling or our unaffected sibling, we see 74% female, and then while our autistic siblings are about 77% male. I think that's not surprising, but something to point out too. If we think about our findings, we kind of group them into different categories, and I'll preface the results here by just saying these findings are representative of the thoughts and feelings of the siblings who are in our study. They don't necessarily apply to everybody, but just keep in mind this is the sample that we are working with. So first we'll look at sibling relationship, and this is both in terms of the past, so during childhood, and also current, so during adulthood. All of our siblings were adults. General findings in that sibling relationship piece, we know that sibling contact, that can be in the form of face-to-face communication, instant messaging, text messaging, emails, video chats. Those tend to decrease over time from childhood through adulthood, and that's especially when the parents are still involved. And when we think about what this will probably look like, there's not data to show this, but based on what we think probably happens, as siblings potentially take on that caregiving role, we would likely see that pattern change, where we see more assistance in helping that sibling. Relatedly, we found 3 pretty common barriers that were presenting that really limited the amount of time that these siblings could spend with their autistic sibling. So unsurprisingly, physical distance was the most commonly endorsed barrier. People moved away for a lot of reasons: jobs, families, other things that just pulled them away and made it more difficult to maintain that contact with their autistic sibling. Second, we saw some what we call social barriers, mainly communication challenges, so making it really difficult to communicate because there are just differences in how we can communicate, different attentional difficulties, those types of barriers. We also saw safety and behavioral concerns, so commonly eloping, aggression. Those were difficult behaviors that made it challenging to be able to maintain that level of contact. Then moving into family planning decisions. Some of those key takeaways, something that really surprised us was that many siblings were unaware or didn't really know the degree to which familial recurrence risk for autism extends to the next generation. And I think what's important here is these siblings were very involved in their autistic siblings' lives. They're choosing to participate in a study on siblings and autism, and they all were really highly educated. And that idea that the kind of transmission of ASD recurrence to that next generation wasn't necessarily a thought for a lot of people, was something that I think represents a nice target for future intervention and future work that we can do to support siblings and just providing the information. So that's a very tangible and feasible thing that we can target. When we asked about how genetics and probability of ASD recurrence in families factored into decisions for these siblings to have children of their own, it was really interesting because siblings differentiated between their firstborn child or kind of the subsequent children. And so when we're thinking about the first child, many siblings said, if I decide that I'm going to have a child, I will have that child regardless of what genetics tell me. If genetics tell me that there's an increased likelihood of autism, I'm still going to have that child because I want a child. And this was in part because our current genetic understanding can't pinpoint an exact percentage, and a lot of the siblings said, if you told me I have a 22% chance, maybe that would be helpful if you were basing that on all of my life circumstances and could give me a really particular individualized number, although right now we can't do that, and so they were saying the range just isn't helpful in terms of making my decision for me for that first child. But when we thought about that second child, that's when things started to change and their interest in genetics really skyrocketed, because now it doesn't just affect the sibling, or now it just doesn't affect the parent, it also affects the first child that they had, who will become potentially a sibling of an autistic individual. And so once they kind of thought about this idea of my child will be in the same position that I was growing up, that kind of made for more information gathering related to genetics and an increased interest in that. This is all to say that I think a lot of people were interested in genetics regardless, but if we had to find a differentiating factor, that was a really interesting piece that I think stood out to us. Next, participation in future research. We were extremely excited because all siblings who participated in the study were very willing and eager to participate in any future phases of the project and also any other sibling research. And this really extended across a broad range of genetics, behavioral, cognitive, whatever word we threw at them, they said yes, as long as it would be helpful potentially to them or to other siblings who were in their same situation. And just a really nice kind of community of siblings who just want to help and have for so long been kind of excluded from research, or just their opinions haven't really been known, and they are really eager to contribute in any way they can. Research topics of interest, and we kind of asked this as, how can we help? What would you need to do to make your lives easier, to make your lives better, and also kind of to help your autistic sibling? Many siblings expressed an interest in better understanding the trajectories and outcomes in ASD and adulthood. And I think this is a common theme that a lot of us have shared, where just longitudinal research going into adulthood is really scarce. And a lot of these siblings were asking questions like, will my autistic brother's aggression continue to worsen? Will it get better? Will it kind of stay the same? Because that will impact how I decide to move forward, what kind of setting would be most appropriate for them, how I can make different planning decisions. Or is my autistic sibling going to be able to do X, Y, Z independently? Can I kind of count on that? Or does the trajectory typically show this general direction? We don't know. And so those unknowns in terms of what to expect for their autistic siblings was something that they were really interested in. Also, support around preparing the autistic individual for that transition to living with their sibling. And this was in terms of how to communicate that to the autistic sibling. How do I describe that you're no longer living with mom and dad, you're coming to live with me? How do I prepare my house for them to move in? How do I make for a smooth transition? What information do I need? And then also, how do I support myself in navigating this really stressful, potentially stressful, and challenging time? Siblings also wanted information related to taking on that caregiving role for their siblings. And they were kind of expressing this need to really solidify their plans and more of that legal paperwork stuff related to taking over care for their autistic sibling before really being able to think about bringing their own children into this world. And sometimes that happened while they're thinking about that process, but this need to really solidify those plans so they felt comfortable and ready to do that. And they mentioned wanting information about simple things, or things that seem pretty simple, but they're pretty complicated: transferring guardianship, navigating Social Security, accessing funds and trusts and wills, housing options for different support needs, just again related to the lack of longitudinal research and adult research. What happens if all of a sudden the aggression doesn't improve and they can't live with me anymore? What are my options for housing if I have a young child here too? So all of these points seem very simple, but they are incredibly complex, and there's no guide out there that really helps with this. And this was a consistent, just daunting task that I think a lot of them endorsed wanting support. And I know we've been in talks with ASF and a few groups to be able to provide this, so more on that coming.
Dependent on my mom, and would likely be dependent on someone else as well as she gets older. My mom actually had me when she was 41, so she's older. She's an older parent in general, so I foresee having to take on that role a little bit earlier in my life, and that worries me a ton. I have no idea. It is, assisted kind of living appropriate? Is living with me full time when I want to raise a family appropriate? Is a full residential? Where do you find them? All of these kind of things, very worrisome, and I know will be difficult to navigate. I'm kind of like trying to push it away in my head, but it will happen.
So just a little clip of the general kind of thought and the conversation, and she was very willing and open to share with everybody kind of her sentiments in this, but I think it's a really important thing and something that was pretty consistently endorsed by most, if not all, siblings who were in the group. the final category of key takeaways was really about advice that these siblings would either give to their younger selves if they could, or to siblings who are currently going through what they maybe went through in childhood. And three main themes really emerged. The first, to be open about your needs and don't be afraid to ask for help. And this was really kind of going back to the idea that there's no such thing as an unaffected sibling. These siblings were urging their younger selves and other siblings to really speak up when support is needed and to recognize that it's okay to ask for help, even if it's clear that your autistic sibling needs maybe additional help or more intensive help than you do. You are still allowed to ask for help, and it's okay, and that you're not kind of a burden adding to the help that's needed. Ask the questions and be part of the conversations, no secrecy. A big thing that a lot of people also talked about is just this idea that things were hidden from them. And as they're growing up, of course, they notice there's some things that are a little different, or I'm not quite understanding why I don't connect with my sibling, why they don't talk to me, why they don't hug me, why they don't want to be around me. Those types of questions, and without the answers of why is this going on, really made for a lot of kind of internalization of these thoughts, but also just this feeling of you're misinterpreting things that are happening, maybe there's some resentment building, and just this shame potentially that was bred through secrecy. And because of this, just an open dialogue was encouraged. Just be open, because that will really help to facilitate conversations and allow for kind of better interactions with siblings. And then finally, learn strategies to connect with your autistic sibling in their unique way. And this primarily was endorsed by siblings who had autistic siblings who lacked spoken language. And this was important because they were exploring different ways to actually connect. They endorsed a lot of difficulty having that bond. And so finding things like, somebody talked about just mimicking the sounds and going back and forth with their autistic sibling and having that cause so much joy. Or going outside and sitting on the porch and watching the birds and just seeing how much that makes their sibling light up. And that can be kind of the bond that you form, but recognizing that there's many different ways to form that bond, and we don't necessarily need spoken language to have that bond. But having somebody kind of tell you that those are different ways that we can create that bond when it doesn't naturally come. And I want to finish by giving a special thanks to the incredible sibling participants, the research team, ASF for generously sponsoring this and funding this project and prioritizing siblings, and my mentor, Dr. Kathy Lord, for making this research possible. Thank you.
We'd like to ask the audience to stand when they ask their question during these afternoon sessions, okay?
I have a question. I'm the only sibling of quadruplets that has autism. And because I live alone, what will siblings do with my guardianship when I'm a self-advocate who lives alone with some support as a high-functioning autistic individual when my parents get older?
That is a great question, and that is something that a lot of siblings asked, and we tried to kind of think about how can we answer that. I don't have any legal background, so can't be helpful for a specific answer, but we are working with ASF and SAMSIB Stick Together to create some type of information session where we can bring in some experts to give advice, legal advice, that can be helpful in establishing those pathways for kind of ensuring a smooth transition for whatever kind of process and support level that your sibling needs or that you need. Yeah, great question though.
Hi, I love your work. I'm so interested in this.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, I saw that most of the respondents were sisters.
Yes.
Right? And I'm wondering if you see any different pattern in terms of the gender match and gender issues in general.
Yes, so we originally intended on just doing 2 focus groups at our UCLA site. We have since done 4, and we amended the IRB again because we are adding 2 more. The brothers have slowly trickled in. They, a lot of them responded a few months later, I just saw your email in my inbox. I would love to participate. So more on what happens with the brothers. But that was a really nice thing because we saw a pretty large percentage of sisters, which was great. Love it. But we also, it would be nice to see what brothers are thinking too. And more on that very soon, hopefully. But the gender match piece, it was primarily, the autistic sibling was primarily male, and the non-autistic sibling was primarily female.
Hi. So I just wanted to say thank you for presenting on this work that you're doing and highlighting the experiences of siblings, as well as the direct impact your research has on participants, which we don't often see since the impact is often long-term in research. So this is very meaningful. And as a sibling of a young adult who struggles with mental health, I often worry about like her future and how to care for her. So hearing this sibling's experience, I'm wondering, how is the Baby Sips project assisting elder siblings towards finding resources to help assist their younger siblings as they transition into adulthood? Like, what kind of resources are you guys pointing them to that they could use for like financial assistance, for instance, and supporting their siblings on this journey?
That is a great question. That is something that we are still kind of in the works figuring out what we can access and what would be helpful. I think a big part of this is there's no one answer for every situation. Different states have different laws that are in place. There's different roads to navigate that depending on what state you're living in, what types of services your sibling has kind of had access to, what types of services insurance will cover, how long you've been or your sibling has been kind of on that journey of getting services, lots of different factors. So I think what we are trying to do is establish ways to get more general information and then have these opportunities for more individualized advice kind of gathering sessions that are more tailored to wherever you are living. But I think right now we are still up in the air because everything is so different for every single person that there's no kind of one answer fits all in terms of what we can do for SIBs, but we are on it, and I think we know that this is needed, and we know that siblings, this was one of the most highly endorsed things that they want us to do to help. So I think we're working with ASF and other groups to really see what we can do to help. But right now, we don't know, but more on that soon, hopefully.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm a sibling of someone on the autism spectrum, and I was just wondering, is there a statistical breakdown with siblings, like, in terms of living situations? So, like, do the majority of siblings end up living with their affected sibling, or is there a heavier skew towards assisted living?
Great question. So I can only speak probably, I don't know off the top of my head what the research generally shows, but I can speak to what our sample kind of was talking about. I think as we're thinking about the profound autism profile, most of the siblings in our sample who had autistic siblings who meet that profound autism diagnosis, they were very ready to take on their sibling as their caregiver. The one kind of piece to this is if there were safety and behavioral concerns, that was kind of the factor that really differentiated if they were planning to have them live with them or hopefully find a housing situation that was close by, but that could provide that additional support. I think it's a very different situation depending on what services you have access to also, because a lot of the siblings were just voicing that they don't think there are any housing options that are available. They've been trying for years and years and years, and so if nothing's available, then they were saying kind of course I will take my sibling in, but what is the best placement for them to keep them safe and happy, and just not knowing what options are out there to be able to make an informed decision. That's, I think, something that we are trying to help fill in that gap so that they can make that decision. I don't know the research on where kind of the breakdown of based on percentages of where people are, but I think there's especially in our sample, there's a heavy skew to people being ready to take on their sibling as a caregiver.
And So this is really fantastic work, and so I'm curious if you've seen any of the siblings who are, everyone in the sample is non-autistic by design, but I assume that you're seeing elevated rates of other neurodevelopmental conditions, so intellectual and learning disabilities, language impairments, ADHD, etc. And so are you seeing differences in the types of responses to these different open-ended questions by other neurodevelopmental condition status? And does that change when the other neurodevelopmental condition is shared with the autistic sibling versus not?
Great question. So for the purpose of this study, our eligibility criteria was just that you have a sibling with autism and you yourself do not have autism. With that said, there were definitely a lot of disclosures in the focus group that, oh yeah, I have ADHD and I would worry that I wouldn't be able to keep the paperwork for my sibling in check, and I don't know if I would be the best person. Those types of comments. So we know that those concerns were there. Only a few people kind of talked about it in the group, and it wasn't something that we were asking directly, since we were really focused on those specific eligibility criteria. But I think that's a great next step for how we can further differentiate if there's any differences in support that these siblings might need, depending on what they are working with and what difficulties they might have themselves. That's a great question.
Two questions, and they're
Yes.
both the same. Is in the sample you looked at, was there an ability to take out and analyze based on income of families as well as the culture or the family setting?
Great question. So we just collected as kind of a supplementary part of this research. We did send out a survey to get this information. Initially, we were just hoping that we would get enough people to really get a nice sample. In our sample, we included siblings of autistic individuals who were part of Dr. Kathy Lord's longitudinal study, so tracking kids from age 2, now they're 35. So we had that set of individuals who are really eager to participate in research and know us well. And then we also recruited from the community. And so because of that, we just wanted to spread it as wide as we could. We didn't have any kind of information to be filled out. We just said, come one, come all, and you can turn your camera off, you can mute yourself, change your name, whatever you want. We won't ask any information from you, just to have everybody really open. And then they had all said, if you send me a survey or if you send me anything, I would be more than happy to talk about stuff that I wasn't willing to maybe talk about in the group setting. So in that survey data has come in, and we will be analyzing that shortly. But I assume there will be differences. We talked about culture in the survey and also income. Great question. Yes.
Thank you. I know there's no one size fits all.
Yes.
I know you're not an attorney, but this is something that my wife and I are actually going through right now. Is there, in your conversations, in your research, was there any conversations you had about having a sibling be a trustee in a trust? And and to the extent you can share that, are there any rules of thumb about it?
Yes. So the participant who you saw on the screen, I cut it off because the video was way too long and I was pressed on time. But she has said something along those lines, and her reaction was, I'm just going to push that off because I have no idea what I'm doing. And it's something that just isn't talked about until it's in this point where it really needs to happen, and then you don't have time to figure it out, and then there's just stress, and it's a really chaotic situation for everybody. So short answer is no. Nobody knew the answers to what to do. People asked the group, does anybody have any information or any websites that they can send me that would help me know how to access this information? And there was not a single resource available. We checked online, nothing, just very general, like seek out an attorney who knows the laws of your state. Yep.
I'm going to ask,
Yes.
I get the last question. So you guys, you had published earlier about the beneficial effects on the person with autism by having a sibling. We always wonder, because we know all these amazing siblings, anecdotally, do you see that more of them kind of go into like a helping profession? I mean, I know that wasn't expected to be part of your analysis, but just that's what we see. Doesn't mean that's true, but what's been your experience?
Yes, so we see, just in this group alone, I would say about 70% were in a profession that kind of related to either helping, teaching mental health. So lots of SLPs, lots of special ed teachers, lots of psychologists, lots of mental health practitioners. We had a lot of even people who weren't necessarily established in their careers, just this really innate desire to do some field that was a helping field. So we do see that, and I think a lot of, we briefly touched on that just because we were interested and we noticed that pattern in the groups, and a lot of them said it just comes from you take on that caregiving role or just that support role more intensely than maybe you would in a sibling relationship where your sibling doesn't have autism, and that just breeds this desire to help and this understanding that you're good at helping and you have the experience helping and you want to help. And we saw, like you mentioned, there's a lot of really positive impacts that having an autistic sibling has on the non-autistic siblings' development. And I know there's a lot of studies out there that show all these mental health negative effects that we see in siblings later on in life. But what I think we were really excited to see, and what our research really focuses on, is what can we see that's actually positive? What are the gains that are made by having an autistic sibling? And we see a lot of benefits that extend past just the mental health pieces that I think a lot of other studies focus on. So we're hopeful, but yes, siblings do go into helping professions more often than not, according to our sample.